Hey, good evening. This is the live portion of our 30-year celebration of Transradial here, and we get an opportunity to talk about some of the issues brought up in the discussions we've already had and how they may affect us. I think, a lot of what we heard was from a European side, and we can offer a little bit here on the North American experience. I know at this point in time, we're looking at a pretty good penetration in the European centers. The US still lags a little bit behind. And what's always been a big question in my mind is how our non-coronary folks are doing. Do either one of you two have any thoughts on, if you say the overall use in Europe is 80 to 90%, in the US, let's say 60 to 70%, what sort of non-coronary penetration the Transradial has?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I'd like again to thank Terumo for putting this together. It's a privilege to be part of this group of speakers. I think that we did a survey years ago, and it's about, depending on, in US, is about 20 to 25% of the visceral interventions are performed nowadays under radial access. Globally, certainly is way less than that, but I think that's where Terumo has the opportunity to invest in education and better devices and potentially expand that market, because we definitely saw in a randomized clinical trial that we conducted years ago, the patients prefer radial access. Every 5 patients, 4 prefer, and that has been systematically shown in several studies. And I think it's not about us anymore, right? It's about what's best for patients, what patients prefer, and how can we build up everything we can do around best practices. So I would say 20 to 25% in US.
Yeah, well, one of the concepts I think that Olivier alluded to in his talk is that not only is it about the patient, but it's also about the physician, and how the physician can go home and get a good night's sleep. The physician doesn't need to worry about the retroperitoneal hematoma. I think one of the other things that is often overlooked in the European environment, but is much more important in the American environment, is I think you live in a safer legal situation with the Transradial. You're never going to get a retroperitoneal bleed, and that is one of the most common causes for a legal action in the catheterization lab in the United States. You also have much less problems with life-threatening type situations based on vascular access. I think that's something that often the cardiologists in the US sort of discount. They don't think about that as something the radial can do for them to make their life easier. And I think that's a consideration going forward. Olivier, what do you think are the most important things to maintain the patency of the radial artery? Because clearly the radial's not one and done. We need arteries that are still present the next time we come around. What would you give as the most important points to keep those radial arteries open?
Yeah, well, I would make a preliminary comment. I think that fortunately, more and more new kids on the block doing radial. I would say that the trend or the old habit to neglect radial artery occlusion was probably part of the history. Now, if you remember when we did the survey in 2010, if I remember, we did observe that for 50% of radialists around the world, including in the US, they did not even pay attention whether the radial artery was still patent at the time of hospital discharge. And I think because of the multiple efforts, statements, and papers and studies, that now we are reporting rates, as you know, from disco radial or similar studies, we are well below the 5% that every radialist has been claiming for years, that radial artery occlusion was in the 5% range and there was no consequence. I think we do realize now that this is probably not acceptable anymore. Again, if you think about the legal environment, you have to do anything you can to preserve. There is also accumulating data from the surgeon side that this radial artery occlusion may have mid and long-term consequences for patients. So coming back to your initial questions, I think the two main factors that we have learned is first, that the flow should be maintained in the radial artery during the hemostasis phase for whatever the methods. I mean, it can be very labor-intensive from nurse. And the second aspect at this time, not completely solved, is that the patient has to be anticoagulated with, let's say, IV heparin or low molecular weight heparin. I mean, we're not even quite sure. As you know, there has been some data from Greece and Europe claiming that should go on the upper range of anticoagulation in order to maximize the benefit of reducing the risk of radial artery occlusion. I'm not sure, because this contradicts a little bit the rate of the dosage that we use every day for a practice, considering diagnostic of PCI. But I would say that in order to establish your quality of care and reducing or minimizing the risk of radial artery occlusion, you should use, let's say, non-occlusive hemostasis that we call usually keeping pattern hemostasis during the, let's say, 1 or 2 hours period, and the patient must be anticoagulated. I would say that maybe the use of thin wall sheet like the slender sheet and smaller sides, these have all contributed to the minimization of that risk. That's my perception at this time.
Marcelo, what do you think is a proper goal, or what do you think should be our target radial artery occlusion rate?
Well, we did an extensive we published last year the JVIR standards of practice in the Society of Interventional Radiology, and most of the complications, including radial artery occlusion, should be less than 1%. That's the threshold that is expected. We conducted a prospective randomized clinical trial, more than 124 interventions. Also did the case series of over 150 patients. And our incidence of complication is less than 1%. And I think I'd like to make a few quick comments here that are, to me, are very important as we develop the 7 steps of performing radial access successfully. That works for us. It's not the only way to do it, by no means. But I'd like to emphasize 5 things. One is to make sure that there is a good measurement or compatibility between the sheath outer diameter and the radial artery. That's why we measure the AP diameter of the radial artery in 100% of our patients, regardless if they are emergency or elective cases. The second thing is to have a single wall, preferably, sometimes double wall if needed, but preferably single wall ultrasound guided puncture. Adequate guidance during the puncture. Second thing, as Olivier expressed well, use heparin. For cancer patients, we usually use 3,000 of heparin at the beginning, followed by 1,000 of heparin every 30 minutes. If you're going to use, you perform a more complex case that requires sometimes dual access and mobilize the catheter inside the vessels, like in bilateral PAE, prosthetic artery embolization, UFE, or PAD cases, we started with 5,000 of heparin, and again, every 30 minutes, another 1,000. And at the end of the case, I would say that using the patent hemostasis is critical. So I think it's a combination of factors that would lead to a successful low rate of radial artery occlusion, and not a single factor that it would be determining the success or not.
So I think we all probably would agree that 1% is probably a good, that's a good target for a lab to have. And as Olivier pointed out, many labs don't check the radial artery on the way out, and that really should be part of your quality assurance program. At this point, I think we're sort of coming to a close here. We always want to try to make these webinars better. And if you could take a couple minutes to fill in the satisfaction survey. Many of us would appreciate that. There's a QR code you can use, or you can use a dedicated button on the top of the web page. Your feedback is important to help us improve the content of this and future events, and we'd like to thank you for your time. So in summary, we've heard from many of the leaders in this field over the last 30 years, and I think we have several take-home messages here. We have a transradial access that started 30 years ago as a curious innovation with an uncertain future. Today, it's clearly been a disruptive access approach and has been accepted globally as a standard of care for standard endovascular procedures, both cardiac and non-cardiac. Today, radial access can be used for most PCI procedures, including complex and CTO procedures. Non-coronary interventions can also take advantage of radial access. And I think this really represents an area for further growth, since the coronary side of the business has really matured over the last 30 years. And finally, radial access will only remain a viable long-term access if we can learn how best to maintain the long-term patency of the radial artery free of radial artery occlusion. If we don't maintain it, we won't be able to use it in the long run. And I think we need to show people that we have an access site that, as they say in our national parks, leave nothing behind, and have it available for the future. So with that, wish you all well. Thank you very much for joining us, and good night.